How does a CEO destroy his own company by firing the only man who understands their regulatory bonds? What happens when a $750 investor walks in on Monday and asks where that man is? And what if that man already decided he will never quietly save them again? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My name is Daniel Reed, and for most of my adult life, I believed that quiet, careful work spoke for itself. I never wanted to be the loudest man in the room or the one standing in front of a camera. I liked numbers, rules, and systems that did not care about ego. For 15 years, I sat at the same cluster of desks on our risk floor, under the same humming lights, with the same 2 monitors and the same company mug. Every morning, I arrived a little before 8. Every morning, the screens lit up with bond positions, covenants, and regulatory deadlines that almost no one else in the building actually understood. That was my normal, and for a long time, I thought it was enough. I logged in, opened the system, and checked the overnight changes. A junior analyst had booked a new position in a bond that had strict capital limits, and he had put it into the wrong bucket. It looked like a small thing, just a different field in a form, but that one mistake could have pushed us over a regulatory limit that would have triggered a review. I saw it, sighed, and quietly fixed it. I sent the analyst a calm note explaining what needed to be different next time. I did not expect a thank you. I knew he would probably tell his team lead that the system caught it, instead of saying that I did. That was how it usually worked. The morning moved with the usual rhythm of keyboard taps, phone calls, and the low rumble of traders pretending that rules were optional. I walked to the printer to pick up a report and heard 2 sales guys joking behind me. One of them said that risk always made things harder for them. The other replied that if we did not have people like me, we could double our numbers. They did not know I was close enough to hear, or maybe they did and did not care. I kept walking, took my papers from the printer, and pretended not to feel the sting in my chest. At 10, a calendar reminder popped up on my screen. It was about the upcoming visit from a large institutional investor, the one everyone had been whispering about for months. The reminder still had my name on it as the contact for regulatory bonds. I closed it and turned back to my work. For most of the day, I focused on the same slow, careful tasks. I checked that covenants were still respected, that counterparty limits were not breached, that the filings we sent last week matched the exact language required by the regulator. These details bored almost everyone in the office, including our CEO, but they were the reason the firm could even run. In the early afternoon, a message arrived from the CEO's assistant. She told me that Grant, our CEO, wanted to see me in his office at 3. Nothing in the message said it was serious, but I had worked with him long enough to feel a small knot of unease in my stomach. I answered that I would be there, saved my work, and kept my face calm. Around lunchtime, I walked down to the company cafeteria. The cafeteria was open and bright, with long tables where people from different teams mixed. I usually sat near the corner and ate quietly, sometimes with 1 or 2 people from my floor who still respected what I did. That day, as I waited in line, I saw Tyler, the CEO's nephew, already holding court at a central table. Tyler was 30 years old, loud, and always dressed like he was about to step onto a stage. He had joined the company a year earlier, and within months he had been given the title of Chief Strategy Officer. He loved big words, big slides, and big promises. Details bored him even more than they bored his uncle. I carried my tray to an empty spot and began to eat. After a minute, I realized Tyler was talking about me. He was describing a recent meeting with another investor, waving his fork in the air to show how passionate he had been. He said that the only thing slowing them down was internal risk, and then he pointed his chin toward my table. He told the group that I always wanted more documents and more checks, and that I still believed regulators read every line. The table laughed. Someone asked who I was exactly, and Tyler said that I was the guy who says no, and called me our internal auditor of vibes. The group kept laughing, and a younger analyst actually turned to look at me. Our eyes met for a second. He realized I had heard everything and then quickly looked away. I did not say anything. I kept eating and stared at my food until the taste turned dull. The humiliation was small and childish, but it was public, and everyone at that table would remember it. They would not remember the overnight fix I made that morning that kept us from a real problem. They would remember the joke about the boring man in risk who blocked their fun. I finished my lunch and quietly left the cafeteria. When 3 o'clock came, I walked up to the top floor where the executive offices were. The air felt different there, a little colder and a lot quieter. Grant's corner office had glass walls, a long view over the city, and a sitting area where he liked to meet with important guests. His assistant nodded and waved me in. Grant stood near the window, arms folded, looking out at the skyline. When he turned toward me, he put on his usual smooth expression. He told me, in his polished way, that the company was entering a new phase. He spoke about growth, speed, and big opportunities with major investors. He said that to keep momentum, they needed people who were not afraid to lean forward and tell a stronger story. He then mentioned our upcoming meeting with a large investor who held hundreds of millions in our bonds and other placements. He said that these investors wanted to hear optimism, not long explanations about regulations. He told me that, during the visit, I should stay in the background, maybe prepare some notes for Tyler instead of speaking myself. I stood calmly and listened. I reminded him, in simple words, that the regulatory bonds for this investor named me personally as the responsible officer. I said that my name was on the filings and that the investor expected to see the person whose signature they trusted. Grant waved this away with a small smile. He said that titles could be changed, signatures could be delegated, and that I should not worry about the ceremony around it. He said that the investor did not care about the exact name, as long as the story sounded right. In that moment, I understood something important. He did not see me as a professional with specific legal duties. He saw me as a piece of scenery he could rearrange to fit his stage. I left his office with a polite nod, as if the conversation had been normal. On the inside, something in me felt a little more tired than usual. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of checks, emails, and small corrections. I showed a junior analyst how to read one of the more complex bond terms and explained why a certain limit mattered. He nodded and said that he understood, but I knew he would forget half of it by next week. Near the end of the day, I gathered my things and headed home. I kept my shoulders straight as I stepped into the elevator, but my mind replayed Tyler's jokes and Grant's dismissive tone again and again. At home, Leah met me at the door. She works long shifts as a nurse, and she has seen every kind of human pain. She took one look at my face and asked how my day had been. I told her about the cafeteria, about Tyler's jokes, and about Grant's meeting. I described how Tyler had called me the man who always says no. I told her that the CEO wanted me invisible for the investor, even though the contracts tied my name to the bonds. Leah listened in silence, sitting at the kitchen table while I leaned against the counter. She said that this was not the first time they had used me and then pushed me aside. She reminded me of the weekends I spent at the office when the firm was smaller, when I used to carry paper files to the regulator by hand because the systems were still broken. She asked how many nights I had missed dinner with our kids when they were small because I was fixing someone else's mistakes to keep the company out of trouble. I could not argue with her. I only shrugged and said that it was my job. She looked at me with tired eyes and asked if anyone there ever did the same for me. I did not have an answer. After dinner, I loaded the dishwasher and wiped the table while Leah went to shower. The apartment was quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of the fridge and the faint noise of traffic outside. I walked into the small room we use as a home office. The desk was simple, just a laptop, a lamp, and a row of folders neatly lined up on a shelf. Each folder held copies of things I considered important enough to track for myself, not for the company. Old notes, personal summaries, and paper copies of key structure diagrams I had drawn to make sense of complicated deals. My eyes moved slowly along the labels. There were folders for early policy drafts, for internal training material, for a few old projects that had already matured. Then my gaze stopped on one of the thicker folders. The label read, in my own handwriting, investor side letters and bond covenants. For a second, I just looked at it. I did not open it. I did not pull out any documents or rate any clauses. I only stepped closer, rested my fingertips on the cardboard edge, and slid the folder a little closer to the front of the shelf, where it would be easier to reach. When I woke up the next morning, my first thought was not about Leah or breakfast or anything normal. My first thought was the way my fingers had rested on that folder the night before. It felt strange, because for years I had trained myself not to think of those papers as mine. Everything I built at the company, I told myself it belonged to the firm. Policies, frameworks, side letters, filing systems, even simple diagrams. They all lived under the logo, not under my name. But as I stood in the shower with hot water on my back, I remembered a different time, when that belief had seemed true. When I joined the firm 15 years earlier, it was small and messy and almost broke. The office back then was a narrow floor above a coffee shop. The windows were dirty, the chairs did not match, and half the computers froze twice a day. Grant's father, the founder, was still in charge. He was rough and direct, but he respected people who knew things he did not. He hired me because I understood regulations better than anyone he had met. On my first week, he handed me a box of old files and said he needed someone to make sense of them. There were contracts with yellow edges, half-signed forms, and letters from the regulator with warning tones. I spent weeks sorting them, building a simple map of what we were allowed to do and what would get us in serious trouble. I worked late almost every night. I ate cold takeout at my desk and rode the last tram home. The founder would sometimes walk by, clap me on the shoulder, and say that I was saving his life. It felt good then, honest, and mutual. When we needed to submit something important to the regulator, I would print the documents, place them in a folder, and ride across town to deliver them in person. In those early years, I did not mind the hours. Leah and I had just started our family. Money was tight. The idea that I was helping to build something stable gave me a kind of pride that was new to me. I missed some dinners, but I told myself that it was for us, not just for the firm. As the company grew, things began to change. The old office became too small. We moved into a modern building with glass and steel and shiny furniture. The founder stepped back for health reasons, and his son, Grant, took over. At first, he kept some of his father's habits. He still asked my opinion before signing certain documents. He still came to my floor once in a while and asked if the regulator was happy. Over time, though, he became more interested in image than in structure. He spent more days on planes, traveling to conferences and investor roadshows. He hired branding people and PR firms and started to talk about storytelling instead of compliance. The more the company grew in size, the more invisible my work became. The systems I built years earlier were now stable. They rarely broke. Because problems were rare, people started to believe they did not exist. When nothing crashed, they gave credit to market conditions or their own genius, not to the slow, boring checks that kept the tower from tilting. I carried that history around in my head every day, like a timeline only I could see. It stood behind every decision I made at my desk. It was there when I told traders that a certain exposure was too large, when I told sales that a certain client did not fit our rules. It was there when I wrote the memo that convinced an earlier investor that we took our duties seriously. That memo was the beginning of a relationship that would eventually bring in hundreds of millions in capital, including the big $750 million account everyone now cared about so much. The week after Tyler joined the company, the atmosphere shifted again. He walked onto the floor like someone who had been born for cameras. He had perfect hair, perfect teeth, and an endless list of buzzwords. He liked to say that he was there to modernize us, to bring speed and vision. He treated risk and compliance as old furniture that needed to be pushed into a corner. At first, I tried to be patient. I answered his questions with simple explanations. I showed him where our biggest exposures were and why regulators watch certain ratios more closely than others. He nodded, pretended to listen, and then went back to rewriting pitch decks with bolder numbers and bigger promises. One night, not long before the investor visit was confirmed, I went with a few colleagues to the neighborhood bar. I do not drink much, but I sometimes went along to hear what people said when they were relaxed. The bar had low lights, crowded tables, and a smell of fried food that never really left your clothes. People from our firm liked it because the staff knew their orders by heart. I sat at the end of a long table, nursing a single beer and listening. Tyler sat near the middle with a group of younger employees. He was telling a story about a recent call with a potential client. He raised his voice when he talked about how he had promised flexible terms and easy approval, skipping over half the things we usually checked. Someone asked if Risk would agree to that. Tyler, with a grin, said he had already solved that problem by deleting half the boring risk pages from a draft term sheet. He said that if we left everything in, the client would run away and that we needed to be bold. The group laughed, and someone asked what I would say. Tyler replied that I was old school and still believed regulators read every line. He made it sound like a joke, like believing in gravity was funny. I watched one of the analysts glance at me and then down at his drink, as if he was embarrassed on my behalf. Jonas, the analyst who sat closest to me in the office, leaned toward me and apologized quietly. He said he knew my work kept them safe. He said that some of the younger staff just wanted to impress Tyler. I told him not to worry. I said I had seen this cycle before, in other firms, where people forgot that rules have teeth. Inside, the laughter still hurt. It was one thing to be ignored. It was another to be turned into the punchline of every joke about slow people. A few days after that bar night, the real blow came. I was at my desk, going through end-of-month checks, when a new calendar invite flashed on my screen. It was from HR, with the subject line that simply mentioned a short meeting. The time was set for later that afternoon. My stomach tightened. HR meetings that you do not ask for are rarely good news. I tried to focus on my work until the time came. When the clock hit the hour, I stood up and walked down to the HR floor. Sonia, our HR director, met me at the door of a small beige meeting room. She gave me a polite but strained smile, the kind a nurse gives before a difficult conversation. Grant was already inside, sitting at the far end of the table. He did not stand when I entered, but he gestured to the chair opposite him. Sonia closed the door and sat off to the side, her hands folded on a folder I had never seen before. Grant started with friendly words. He said that the company was realigning resources. and streamlining for the next phase. He talked about how the firm had grown, how proud he was of everyone, and how grateful he was for the foundation I had helped build. The words sounded smooth, but his eyes did not match them. Then he shifted. He said that, at the current stage, they needed people who could lean into growth and tell a bold story to investors. He said that risk and compliance needed a more agile approach. He added that some people were better suited to earlier stages of a company and that it was natural for roles to evolve. Finally, he said that, after careful thought, they had decided to eliminate my role as it currently existed. He used the phrase that I would hear in my head many times later. He said that I was being freed up for new opportunities. Sonia slid the folder across the table. It contained the termination letter, a summary of severance, and instructions about handing back equipment. Grant said that the decision was final. There was no talk of another role, no offer to stay in a different capacity, no suggestion that my knowledge might still be needed. It was clean, cold, and rehearsed. I asked in a low and steady voice who would be responsible for the regulatory bonds and filings I had been handling. I reminded Grant that my name was on the side letter with the big investor and that the regulator still listed me as the contact. He shrugged and said that the firm had plenty of smart people and that they would reassign the duties internally. He said that risk and legal teams could handle the paperwork and that I did not need to worry about details anymore. I turned to Sonia and asked if there were any concerns about notice periods toward the regulator. She looked slightly uncomfortable and said that from an internal HR perspective, everything was in order. It was clear that no one in that room wanted to talk about external obligations. They wanted it to be a simple, sealed event. I realized then that this was not just about saving money or changing structure. It was about removing a person who did not fit the story they wanted to tell investors and staff, a story of fast growth with no friction. I signed what I was asked to sign, keeping my face calm. I did not argue or beg. There is a dignity in silence that some people do not understand. When the meeting ended, Sonia handed me a cardboard box for my things. Grant said that he appreciated my years of service and hoped there were no hard feelings. He stood, shook my hand in a practiced way, and left the room. After he left, Sonia exhaled and told me quietly that she was sorry. She said her hands were tied. I told her I understood. I carried the box back to my floor. The walk through the office felt longer than usual. People looked up, saw the box in my hands, and then quickly looked down at their screens. No one wanted to stare too long at the reminder that loyalty was soft in this place. At my desk, I placed a few personal items into the box. A small framed photo of Leah and the kids when they were younger. The company mug that now felt like an odd joke. A pen I liked. As I picked up the photo, my computer monitor flashed. I turned to look and saw a calendar alert on the screen. In simple blue letters, it reminded me of the upcoming Monday meeting. It still carried the label I had given it months earlier. Investor Review, Regulatory Bonds Sign-Off, Daniel. The office noise faded for a second. I stood there, holding my box, looking at my name on the screen. The reminder was innocent, just a piece of software doing what it was told. But it felt like a small, sharp voice asking whether anyone upstairs really understood what they had just done. I stood there for a few long seconds, watching my own name blink on the screen as if it belonged to a stranger. Investor Review, Regulatory Bonds Sign-Off, Daniel. The meeting was set for Monday at 9. The reminder did not know that HR had just cut my job. It did not know that, according to the people upstairs, I was now freed up for new opportunities. It only knew the facts I had fed into it months ago. I reached over, moved the mouse, and closed the alert. The screen went back to the usual lines of numbers and positions. I shut the system down for the last time. After I dropped off my laptop and badge, I walked slowly through the office with the box in my hands. Some people nodded. A few whispered that they were sorry to see me go. Most kept their eyes on their screens. When you work in finance, you learn early that other people's misfortune is something you look at from the corner of your eye, not head on. You never know when you might be the one carrying the box. At the elevator, I turned once to look at the risk floor where I had spent so many years. The same rows of desks, the same glow of monitors, the same hum of air conditioning. For a moment, I felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind, something I would never get back. Then the elevator doors closed and the view vanished. At home, Leah listened, really listened, while I told her that HR had fired me. I explained the vague words, the realignments, the clean cut. She got angry on my behalf in ways I could not. She paced our small living room and said that they had used me for years and then tossed me out because I did not fit their image of bold, young, fast money. I just sat on the couch, hands folded, feeling more tired than angry. That night I did not sleep well. I woke up twice from shallow dreams where I was still in the office, trying to fix something that would not stay fixed. In the morning, my body moved through the old routine out of habit. I showered, shaved, and made coffee, only to remember that I had nowhere to go. Leah had an early shift at the hospital. She hugged me before she left and told me that we would be fine. She said I had given that firm more than enough. When the door closed behind her, the apartment fell silent. For a while, I just sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from my cup. Part of me wanted to send Grant a long message explaining all the things he was ignoring. Another part of me wanted to delete every trace of the company from my life. Instead, I did something simple. I went into the home office and opened the folder I had touched the night before: investor side letters and bond covenants. Inside it were printed copies of key summaries I had written for myself about our largest institutional accounts. Not formal legal documents, just my own maps in plain language so I could explain complex structures to non-specialists. I flipped through until I found the notes for the big investor everyone was so excited about, the one whose money sat behind hundreds of millions of our bonds. I read my own handwriting and remembered the meetings that had led to those notes. I remembered the first time I met Maria, the senior representative from that fund. She had flown in with a small team. She was calm, reserved, and clearly used to people trying to impress her. During the due diligence, she had asked sharp, precise questions about our controls. She had not cared about our office decor or our marketing slogans. She wanted to know who actually held responsibility when something went wrong. At one point, she had asked to speak with the person who signed our regulatory filings. I had walked into the room with a stack of reports, expecting her to glance at them and move on. Instead, she asked about my background, how long I had been at the firm, how we handled mistakes. She said something I never forgot. She told me that many firms had beautiful stories but very weak skeletons. She said her fund trusted bones, not makeup. Later, when we drafted the side letter that governed some of their placements, there was a clause that tied certain approvals to my role as responsible officer. Not to a generic title, but to me by name. At the time, I had felt a quiet sense of responsibility. I did not see it as power. It was just another weight I was willing to carry. Sitting in my home office now, unemployed, I saw it a little differently. In my notes, I had written a simple sentence to remind myself of the logic behind that clause. It said that if the responsible officer was removed, any increase in exposure would require a fresh review and explicit approval from the investor, with updated information about who was taking over the duty. I read that line twice. Then I closed the folder. I did not print anything new. I did not send it to anyone. I simply placed the folder back on the shelf, but this time in a spot where I could see it clearly from the chair. That afternoon, I decided to leave the apartment and clear my head. I went downtown to a co-working space where you could rent a desk by the day. I had used it once before for a side course I took. The room was quiet, with simple tables, power outlets, and a constant low murmur from other people working on their own problems. I paid for a day pass, sat at an empty desk, and opened my personal laptop. For the first hour, I did nothing related to the firm. I updated my resume, wrote down a rough list of contacts to call, and checked a few job boards. It felt strange to see myself described in generic phrases. Experienced risk officer. 15 years in regulatory oversight. Strong record of building frameworks. Those words were true, but they looked thin on the screen, like an outline without flesh. At some point, a message popped up on my phone. It was from Jonas. He wrote that people in the office were shocked I was gone. He said that Tyler had already taken over my desk and was asking where certain files were. Jonas added one more line that stuck with me. He said that Tyler had asked if there was a master regulatory bond ledger somewhere on the shared drive, and seemed confused when no one could find it. I stared at that sentence for a long moment and felt something in me click into place. The ledger he meant was not a single file. It was a system of cross-checked registers, templates, and procedures that lived partly in our software and partly in my head. I had designed it to satisfy both the regulator and the investor. It was not a magical secret, but it was not something you could pick up in a week either. I replied to Jonas with a short message. I thanked him for letting me know and told him to focus on his own work, not to get caught in the middle of politics he could not control. Then I put the phone face down on the table and leaned back in my chair. In the co-working space, people tapped on keyboards, took calls, and drank coffee. No one knew that, in another part of the city, a growing firm had just removed the one person who understood a key part of its skeleton. I felt no joy at that thought, just a quiet, cold clarity. A few days later, I found myself in an airport lounge. Months earlier, before any of this happened, Leah and I had booked a short trip to visit her sister in another city. We had decided to go anyway, partly because the tickets were non-refundable and partly because I needed to get out of my head. Leah sat beside me reading something on her phone while I watched planes move slowly on the runway. On a screen nearby, the business news channel played in a loop. At one point, the anchor mentioned our firm's name and praised its rapid growth. A photo flashed on the screen. It showed Grant and Tyler at some conference, smiling broadly with drinks in their hands. A caption announced that they were meeting key institutional partners to discuss expanding placements. I recognized the background of the photo. It was the lobby of the same hotel where we had once hosted Maria and her team. I could imagine the scene without effort. Grant and Tyler talking about vision and speed, slides full of big numbers and big promises. My name not mentioned once, even though the safety of those numbers still sat on top of structures I had designed. Next to me, Leah glanced at the screen and then at me. She asked if I regretted anything. I thought about it for a moment and told her the truth. I said I did not regret the work itself. I regretted trusting that the people on top would always value the structure as much as the story. She squeezed my hand and said that some people only learn the difference when the story breaks. When we came back from the trip, I went straight from the airport to the co-working office. I did not want to sit at home with my thoughts. I opened my laptop and my own notes. I went through every major relationship the firm had that involved regulatory bonds. I did not change anything. I just refreshed my own memory. When I reached the section about the $750 million investor, I read each line carefully. I confirmed for myself how the side letter tied certain approvals to my role. I read again the simple rule that if the responsible officer changed, the investor needed updated information and had the right to reassess exposure before adding more capital. On my screen, I highlighted that sentence so it stood out. Then I copied my notes for that investor onto a small USB drive I kept with my personal documents. These were not company secrets or client data. They were my own summaries in plain language, the ones I had written to help myself explain things clearly. I did not plan to publish them or weaponize them. I only wanted to make sure that, if someone asked me later what had been agreed, I would be able to answer clearly. As I slid the USB drive into a side pocket of my bag, I felt a quiet shift inside me. It was not rage, not even real anger. It was something sharper and steadier. For years, I had assumed it was my job to protect the firm from the natural consequences of its own choices. I had worked nights and weekends to build buffers around other people's arrogance. Sitting there, in a rented chair with my entire career reduced to a few folders and files, I understood that I did not have to keep doing that. If the people in charge wanted to act as if the skeleton did not matter, they were free to do so. But they were not entitled to my silence if someone outside the firm asked for the truth. When I left the co-working space that evening, the early winter air felt sharp on my face, but my thoughts were clearer than they had been in days. I walked slowly toward the train station, passing bright shop windows full of things people buy to feel successful. Suits, watches, expensive bags. Inside the glass, smiling models sold the idea that image is everything. Outside the glass, I thought about how many of those images were built on quiet work like mine that no one ever wanted to look at. For most of my career, I accepted that as part of the deal. I would be the man behind the curtain, and other people would stand under the lights. Now that I had been pushed out of the building entirely, that old deal did not make sense to me anymore. If they wanted the lights, they could also live with the shadows they had ignored. The next morning, I went back to the co-working office with a more deliberate plan. I was not there to rescue the firm or to plot some wild revenge. I was there to understand my position clearly, inside the law, so I could decide how to move forward without guessing. I opened my laptop and made a simple list. On one side, I wrote what I knew for a fact about my old role, my contract, and the investor side letters. On the other side, I wrote what I did not know, the parts that needed expert answers. For years, I had helped other people see risk clearly. Now I needed to do that for myself. When the list was done, one thing was obvious. I needed legal advice that was not paid by the company. There was one person I trusted for that. His name was Eric Morales, an old classmate from my early days who had become an employment lawyer. We had kept in loose contact over the years, sending each other short messages on holidays or when we saw some strange case in the news. I had never asked him for professional help before. That morning, I scrolled through my contacts until I found his number. My thumb hovered over the call button for a second. A part of me still felt disloyal even thinking about it, as if asking for outside advice was a kind of betrayal. Then I remembered the HR room, the cardboard box, and the phrase, "freed up for new opportunities." Whatever loyalty I still felt was clearly not shared by the people who used it as decoration in termination speeches. I pressed call. Eric picked up on the second ring. I told him, in plain words, that I had been let go from the firm and that I needed to understand where I stood. He did not interrupt. When I mentioned that my name was on investor side letters and regulatory filings, his tone changed from casual to focused. He said we should not talk details over the phone and asked if I could come to his office that afternoon. I agreed. When the call ended, I felt a small weight lift from my chest. I had taken a step that was about me, not about saving a company that had no trouble letting me go. Eric's office was in an older building near the courthouse, with worn stone steps and narrow hallways. Inside, it was warmer and filled with shelves of thick books and case files. He greeted me with a firm handshake and an expression that mixed concern with curiosity. We sat at a simple wooden table instead of his formal desk, which made the conversation feel less like an interrogation and more like a talk between old friends. I told him the story from the beginning. How I joined the firm, how my role grew, how the founder had trusted me, how things shifted when Grant and Tyler took over the narrative. I explained the investor relationship, the side letter, and the fact that the bond structures tied certain approvals to my role as responsible officer. I told him about the HR meeting and the way Grant had brushed off my questions with phrases about reassigning duties internally. Eric asked careful questions. He wanted to know if I had copies of my employment contract, if there were any non-compete clauses, and whether my job description mentioned specific regulatory duties. He asked if the side letter with the big investor named me personally or just my title. I answered as precisely as I could from memory and from the notes I kept for myself. He frowned when he understood that the investor had been told I was the one who would sign off on certain changes and that the regulator still had me listed as the contact for those bonds. He explained in simple terms what this meant from a legal point of view. He said that once the firm terminated my employment, I no longer had the authority to sign anything on their behalf. I could not be their responsible officer in practice, even if my name was still on some documents. He also said that I had no duty to provide free transition work unless it was clearly written in an agreement, which it was not. The company had chosen to end the relationship. They could not end it and still expect me to carry the same weight in silence. He added that if they continued to act as if I was still in that role without fixing it, that could become a problem for them with both the investor and the regulator. I asked him what my own risks were. I did not want to hurt anyone, but I also did not want my name attached to decisions I no longer controlled. Eric told me that my main responsibility now was to tell the truth if asked by the right people. If the investor or regulator came to me with questions, I should answer clearly about my employment status and what I had done or not done since leaving. I should not guess or speculate, just describe facts. He said that doing this would protect me and also respected the system we both believed in. That system only works when the people involved do not lie to keep someone else's story alive. When we finished, Eric leaned back and studied me for a moment. Then he said that, in his opinion, the firm had made a very foolish move. He did not mean only in human terms, but in structural terms. He said that removing the one person who knew how their skeleton worked right before a major investor review showed an arrogance he had seen before in other cases. It never ended well. I smiled a little at that, not from joy, but from recognition. I had seen it too, watching other firms fall when they treated rules like a decoration instead of a foundation. After I left Eric's office, I walked 2 blocks to a small cafe and sat with a cup of coffee, going over our talk in my head. Nothing he said had turned me into some secret mastermind. There was no brilliant trick or hidden weapon. All he had done was shine a light on what was already true. I was no longer their responsible officer. I had no duty to patch holes they chose to make. And if someone with real authority asked what had happened, I would be expected to answer honestly. Those simple facts felt more powerful than any dramatic gesture I could have invented. There was one more question I needed answered, and for that I had to go to another building entirely. A few days later, I scheduled a short meeting at the Securities Commission. I did it by the book, through the usual channels, asking for general guidance about a change in employment affecting regulatory bonds. When the day came, I put on a plain suit, the same kind I used to wear when I walked my firm's filings there years ago. The Commission's building was clean and dull, with metal detectors at the entrance and the faint smell of paper and printer ink in the air. I checked in, received a visitor badge, and was led to a neutral meeting room with a simple table and 3 chairs. The official who joined me was a man named Kowalski, someone I had met in passing years earlier when I submitted documents in person. He recognized my name and gave a small nod. I did not bring any company documents with me. I spoke carefully, using general terms. I described a situation where a firm had a named responsible officer on file for certain bonds, and then removed that person from employment. I asked, as a matter of procedure, what normally happened next and what the commission expected from each side. Kowalski answered in the same calm, neutral tone I remembered. He said that if a firm removes a named responsible officer, they are expected to notify the commission and provide updated information about who will take over. He said that, until that process is complete, the records still show the old contact. If major changes are made without updating those records, the commission might ask questions later. He also said that individuals who leave such roles do not remain responsible for new actions taken after they go, but their names remain attached to past filings. Then he added something that made me sit a little straighter. He said that in some recent years they had seen firms treat responsible officers as formalities, changing them without proper notice while continuing to expand risk. When that happened, and when large institutional investors were involved, it sometimes led to formal reviews. He did not name names. He did not need to. I understood the pattern. Before we ended, he checked his screen and mentioned, almost as an aside, that their current records still listed me as the contact for certain bonds at my old firm. He said that no notice of change had been filed yet. I thanked him for the information and asked if there was anything I needed to do personally. He said that, unless they reached out to me directly, my main duty was simply not to misrepresent my status to anyone. If someone asked whether I still worked at the firm or still signed for them, I should answer truthfully. That was all. When I left the commission building, I felt the same clear, cold air I had felt leaving the co-working space earlier that week, but this time my mind was even steadier. Between Eric and Kowalski, I now understood the shape of the ground under my feet. I was not plotting anything, I was simply accepting reality instead of fighting it. The company had chosen image over structure. They had fired the man whose name sat under part of their skeleton and had not yet done the work to replace him properly. That was their choice. I did not have to cushion the impact. On the tram ride home, I watched people stare into their phones, scrolling through their own worries and distractions. My own phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Leah. She wrote that she had been thinking about everything and wanted one promise from me. She asked me if they ever realized they needed me and tried to pull me back in for free to please remember how they had treated me and not rush to rescue them again. The message from Leah sat on my screen for a long moment before I answered it. She had asked me very simply to promise that if they ever realized they needed me, I would not run back and fix everything for free. I typed a short reply, telling her that I understood and that I would think carefully before I did anything. It was not a full promise yet, but it was a step in that direction. The truth was, a part of me still felt drawn to the old pattern. For years, whenever the firm was in trouble, I moved without thinking. I just fixed what needed fixing. Sometimes it was pride. Sometimes it was fear of what would happen if I did not. Now, sitting in a tram seat with my phone in my hand, I knew that automatic reaction was one of the reasons they thought they could treat me as both essential and disposable at the same time. The next day, Leah had a day off, and we decided to walk by the river. It was late afternoon, and the air was cold but not painful. The trees were bare, their branches sketching thin lines against the gray sky. She bought coffee from a small stand, and we sat on a worn wooden bench facing the water. For a while, we did not talk about the firm at all. We talked about our kids, about her patients, about small things like what to cook for the weekend. It felt almost normal. Then she turned the conversation back to what she knew was still heavy in my mind. She asked if I had learned more from the lawyer and the regulator. I told her everything in simple words. I said that Eric had explained that I was no longer the firm's responsible officer in practice, even if some documents still carried my name. I said that Kowalski at the commission had made it clear that, once I was removed from the job, new actions were not my burden, but that the records had not yet been updated. I told her that my main duty now was to tell the truth if someone asked me whether I still worked there or still signed off on things. She listened carefully, holding her coffee cup between both hands. Then she asked the question that mattered most. She asked what I would do if the investor or the regulator came to me directly and wanted to know what was going on. I answered before I had time to overthink it. I said I would tell them the truth, I would not exaggerate, I would not try to make anyone look worse than they were, but I would not lie to protect people who had chosen to cut me out. I said I owed that much to myself and to the system I had believed in for so long. Leah nodded slowly and said that this sounded fair to her. She reminded me again of all the nights and weekends I had given to that firm, all the times I had delayed our plans because someone upstream needed me to handle a crisis. She asked if anyone there would have done the same for me if our positions were reversed. I thought about Grant's smooth words in the HR room and Tyler's jokes in the cafeteria. The answer was clear. I told her no, I did not think they would. She then said that maybe it was time to let cause and effect do their work. If people chose image over structure, maybe the best thing I could do now was to stop standing between them and their own consequences. We sat in silence for a while, watching the slow current move past. A few children played near the path. A cyclist went by, head down, focused on his own rhythm. My mind felt strangely calm. There was no big plan forming, no list of steps to take. Just a simple, firm line inside me. I would not run to fix anything for them unless it was truly my duty. And my duty now, as both Eric and Kowalski had made clear, was not to rescue a company that had proudly severed me from its payroll. It was to be honest if people with real stakes asked what had happened. A couple of days later, I was back at the co-working office, sending out a few job applications and updating my profile on professional networks. It felt slow and dull, but it was necessary work. Around midday, my phone rang. It was Jonas. I stepped into the hallway to take the call where it was quieter. His voice sounded nervous. He told me that the atmosphere at the firm was tense and excited at the same time. Everyone knew that the big investor was coming for a review on Monday. There were rumors that more money was coming if the meeting went well. At the same time, people on the risk floor were confused because no one knew who was replacing me in a formal sense. Jonas said that Tyler kept telling people not to worry, that compliance was all set, but no one had seen any real documents about it. He said a few juniors had quietly asked if they should reach out to me for help. Jonas had told them no, because he did not want to drag me back into something I could not control. I thanked him for that. He also told me that Tyler had been walking around the floor with new slides he planned to show the investor, slides that still referenced frameworks I had built, as if nothing had changed. He sounded frustrated as he said this. I could hear in his voice that he respected the work I had done and felt it was wrong for others to pretend it had simply appeared by itself. I listened without interrupting. When he paused, I told him that I could not advise anyone inside the firm now. I said that my employment was over and that it was up to the people in charge to handle the meeting. I also told him, again, to focus on his own role, to keep his head down, and to avoid getting tangled in their politics. He sighed and said he understood. Before he hung up, he said one more thing. He said that if there was any justice, one day the people who laughed at boring risk would see how much it actually held together. After the call, I stood in the hallway for a minute longer, looking out at the street below through the narrow window. Cars moved slowly through the traffic lights. People crossed at the corners. The world outside had no idea that a small group of men in a glass office had built their success on a structure they did not respect. I went back to my desk and opened my email. At the top of the inbox, a new message had arrived from a name I recognized instantly. It was from Maria, the representative of the big investor. She wrote in her usual precise tone without extra words. She said that she had heard from the firm that I was no longer employed there. She asked if I might be available to stop by their hotel suite on Sunday evening before the Monday meeting for a short talk about the current state of certain regulatory matters. She said she had a quick question and wanted to check a few points directly with the person who had been named in earlier documents. She added that there was no obligation, but she would appreciate my perspective. I read the message twice. My first instinct, the old one, was to feel a pull to protect the relationship between the firm and the investor. I had worked hard to build trust with Maria's team over the years. I did not want to see that trust damaged, but then I thought about the exact words she had used. She did not ask me to fix anything for the firm. She asked to clarify what was true. That fell directly into the narrow path both Eric and Kowalski had laid out for me. My duty now was to be honest with people who deserved the truth, not to edit reality to keep someone else's story neat. So I replied. I told her that I was available on Sunday evening and would come to the hotel at the time she suggested. I kept my words simple and formal. I did not offer any comments about the firm. I did not hint at my feelings. I just said that I would be there and would answer her questions as best as I could. On Sunday, I arrived at the hotel a little before the agreed time. It was a high-end place with a quiet lobby, soft lighting, and thick carpets that made footsteps sound distant. I took the elevator up to the floor where the investor had reserved a conference suite. When I knocked, an assistant opened the door and showed me in. The room was large but not overcrowded, with a long table, a few chairs, and a screen at one end. There were folders on the table, but no crowd yet. Only Maria and 2 members of her team were present. She greeted me with a small nod and thanked me for coming. We sat at the table, and she began to ask questions. They were not emotional questions. She asked when exactly my employment with the firm had ended. She asked whether I still had any authority to sign filings or approve changes on their behalf. She asked whether the firm had informed the regulator and her fund of a formal replacement for my role. I answered each question plainly. I gave dates. I said clearly that I no longer worked for the firm and had no authority to sign or approve anything for them. I said that, to my knowledge, no official notice about a new responsible officer had been filed when I left, and that I had not been consulted about any transition plan. I did not speculate on what they might have done internally since then. I only described what I knew. Maria listened without interrupting, making notes. Her team compared my answers to papers in their folders. I saw, out of the corner of my eye, that some of those papers carried familiar headers from my old firm, but I did not lean over to read them. When we finished, she closed her notebook and thanked me again. She did not say what she planned to do with the information. She did not need to. Her calm, focused expression told me that the facts mattered to her more than any flattering story might have. As I stood to leave, I felt no urge to defend the firm or to soften anything I had said. I had simply described reality. Whatever happened next would not be my doing. It would be the natural result of choices made by people who believed structure could be treated like decoration. I walked out of the suite and into the quiet hallway. As I moved toward the elevator, I heard a low mechanical sound from a side room behind a half-open door. Curious, I glanced in as I passed. Inside, a small printer station was busy spooling thick stacks of paper into neat trays. On the top page of one stack, in clear, bold letters, I saw a header that read Monday Investor Session, Regulatory Overview. One of Maria's assistants stood nearby, reviewing a marked-up copy. I heard her say, in a low voice to someone out of sight, that they would need to adjust some of the slides before the morning. On Monday morning, I woke up before my alarm. The sky outside our window was still dark, and the city was quiet. For a moment, I lay there and listened to Leah breathing softly beside me. Then I slipped out of bed, dressed in a simple suit, and made a cup of coffee in the kitchen. I did not feel nervous. I did not feel excited. I felt calm, like someone who has finally decided to tell the truth after years of holding his tongue. Before I left, Leah met me at the door. She asked if I was sure I wanted to go. I told her that Maria had asked me directly and that my duty now was simple. I would answer questions honestly, nothing more. Leah nodded and reminded me of her message from the tram. She said she trusted me not to rescue people who had never once shown they would rescue me. I promised her that I would not offer to fix anything. I would only speak when spoken to. The hotel lobby was busier than it had been on Sunday evening. Men and women in suits moved through the space, holding folders and phones, speaking in low voices. I took the elevator up to the same floor as before, walked down the same quiet hallway, and knocked on the door of the conference suite. This time, when it opened, the room was full. At one end of the table sat Maria and her team, their folders neatly arranged, their faces composed. On the other side sat Grant and Tyler, along with a few senior people from my old firm. There were also 2 other observers, likely from smaller funds that had placed money alongside Maria's. The air felt thicker than it had the night before. Conversations quieted as I stepped in. Grant saw me and forced a smile. He said in his smooth way that it was good to see me and that he was glad I could join them for a friendly catch-up. Tyler looked at me with a tight expression, somewhere between surprise and irritation, as if my presence spoiled a script he had written in his head. Maria simply nodded in my direction and gestured to an empty chair near the end of the table, slightly off to the side. Not with the firm, not with her. Somewhere in between. When everyone settled, Tyler began the meeting with a polished introduction. He clicked through the first slides, talking about growth, new opportunities, and future placements. He spoke quickly, with the confidence of someone used to applause, describing how the firm had scaled and modernized its risk processes. He used some of the same phrases I had seen in their marketing, about robust frameworks and seasoned oversight, as if nothing had changed beneath those words. Maria watched in silence, her hands folded in front of her, her expression unreadable. After a few minutes, she raised a hand slightly. Tyler stopped mid-sentence and looked toward her. She asked if they could move ahead to the section on regulatory bonds and responsible officers. He clicked forward until a slide appeared that showed a structure diagram I recognized instantly. It was one of mine, slightly redesigned with new colors, but still my skeleton. At the bottom of the slide, in small letters, was a line that read, "Responsible Officer, Regulatory Bonds, Daniel Reed." Maria leaned forward slightly and read the line out loud. She then asked Tyler to confirm that the name on the slide was current and correct. The room grew very quiet. Tyler glanced at Grant, then back at Maria. He said, in a lighter tone, that the slide was a bit out of date and that I had recently transitioned out of the firm. He added that the company had a strong team that could handle the duties and that there was no gap in coverage. Maria did not argue. She simply asked him to name the person who now served as responsible officer for those bonds and to confirm when the regulator and her fund had been formally notified of the change. Tyler hesitated. He said that internal processes were underway and that final documentation would follow. Grant stepped in, trying to smooth things over. He said that their legal and risk teams were on top of it, and that this was just a matter of updating titles. Maria listened without changing her expression. Then she turned her head toward me. She asked in a clear and steady voice whether I currently worked for the firm. I answered in plain words. I said no, I did not. She asked when my employment there had ended. I gave the exact date. She asked whether I had signed any regulatory filings or bond approvals for the firm since that date. I said no, I had not. She asked if anyone from the firm had consulted me about a formal transition of my role as responsible officer after my termination. I said no again. They had not. The only contact since then had been informal messages from old colleagues, nothing official. As I spoke, I watched the faces around the table. One of the other investors lowered his eyes to his notes. Another sat a little straighter. Grant's jaw tightened. Tyler's hand gripped the remote so hard his knuckles went pale. Maria's team opened a folder and placed a printed document on the table. I saw my own name near the bottom of the page, next to a signature line I recognized. It was the side letter we had discussed years before. Maria tapped a specific paragraph with her pen and read it aloud, emphasizing the parts that mattered. The clause said that any increase in exposure under these bonds required sign-off from the named responsible officer, or a formal update accepted in writing by the investor after a review of the new officer's qualifications. Then she said that, based on what she had heard, the responsible officer named in the document no longer worked at the firm and had not been replaced through any formal process her team had been shown. She looked at Grant and asked if that understanding was correct. Grant started to speak, stopped, and then said that they were in the process of making updates but had not yet finalized them. He tried to shift the conversation back to growth and potential, but the room no longer followed him. Maria closed the folder with a soft, final sound. She said that her fund had a simple policy. They did not add capital to firms that treated core risk roles as decoration. She said that effective immediately, the planned expansion of their placement with the firm was suspended. She added that, given the lack of clear formal transition for the responsible officer role, they would be reviewing whether to keep their existing exposure at its current level or to reduce it. She also said that they would be contacting the Securities Commission to clarify the status of the filings which still listed my name. Her words were calm, free of anger. That made them hit harder. The other investors at the table exchanged looks. One closed his notebook gently and slipped his pen back into his jacket. Another asked in a careful tone whether Maria would be sharing her findings with them. She said yes, of course. Grant tried to recover. He spoke about misunderstandings, about temporary gaps, about how quickly they could formalize everything. He said that the firm remained strong and that this was just a minor administrative delay. But his voice had lost its shine. Tyler said very little now. His earlier confidence had drained away, leaving a tight, strained mask on his face. As the meeting moved toward its end, Maria thanked everyone for coming. She thanked me specifically for answering her questions without exaggeration or emotion. She said that this kind of clarity was the reason her fund had trusted my signature in the first place. Then she turned back to Grant and said, in a measured tone, that trust was hard to build and very easy to damage. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Papers were gathered. Chairs scraped softly against the carpet. People avoided each other's eyes. I closed the simple notebook I had brought and stood up. No one from my old firm tried to stop me or ask me to stay. I walked past them toward the door. As I reached it, I heard the faint sound of a phone buzzing on the table behind me, then another, like insects trapped under glass. I did not turn around to see who answered first. I stepped into the quiet hallway, pulled the door gently shut behind me, and walked away, while the vibrations continued on the other side.